Welcome to the deep dive. It is March 4, 2026, and we are absolutely thrilled you decided to carve out some time to join us today.
Yeah, thank you so much for being here.
Because if you are prepping for a marathon meeting, or, just trying to catch up on some essential pop culture history, or if you're simply insanely curious about the invisible machinery that operates behind the scenes in Hollywood, you have landed in exactly the right spot.
You really have. We've gotten an incredibly strolling narrative for you today.
We really do.
It's a massive story. We're looking at something that fundamentally touches on almost every single facet of the creative process. I mean, you have the initial spark of artistic inspiration crossing cultural boundaries.
Which is huge on its own.
Right. And then you have the absolute bleeding edge of visual effects technology being pushed to its breaking point. And on top of all that, you have the incredibly fraught, decades-long business of trying to adapt a fiercely protected literary icon for a massive global cinema audience.
Okay, let's unpack this. Today's deep dive is centered entirely on the 2011 3D motion capture film, The Adventures of Tintin.
Or, depending on what territory you live in, you might have seen it billed as The Adventures of Tintin, The Secret of the Unicorn.
Exactly. And we have stacked up some truly fascinating source material to guide our exploration today. We are pulling from an incredibly detailed historical and production overview from Wikipedia just to ground us in the timeline.
Which is necessary because the timeline is wild.
It's unbelievable. But to figure out how this movie actually landed with human beings, we are bringing in some raw, unfiltered audience reactions. We have a hyper-enthusiastic YouTube movie review by the critic Jeremy Jans.
He loved it.
He really did. And to provide some serious friction against that, we are diving into a collection of deeply, intensely critical IMDb reviews written by die-hard purist fans of the original comic books.
Bringing those specific sources together is crucial, because we can't just look at the objective chronological facts of a film's production.
Right, you need the context.
Exactly. We need to contrast that factual history with the visceral, popcorn-spilling excitement of a mainstream moviegoer, and then weigh both of those against the meticulous, highly protective scrutiny of a hardcore fan base. It gives us a complete 360-degree view of how a singular piece of media can just fracture an audience.
And that leads right into our mission for today. We want to figure out how a literal dream team of cinematic titans, Steven Spielberg and Peter Jackson, managed to combine revolutionary technology with beloved mid-century European comic books, only to create a film that is simultaneously hailed as a masterpiece of sweeping action and fiercely torn apart as a creepy, over-commercialized Hollywood misstep.
Yeah, how do you get such a violently polarized reaction from a pedigree like that?
Exactly. To figure that out, we have to rewind the clock significantly, because this was not just a script that slid across Spielberg's desk one afternoon in the 2000s.
Not at all. The gestation periods for this film is staggering. We actually need to go back 30 years before a single frame was ever rendered.
Picture the cultural landscape of 1981. Steven Spielberg has just unleashed Raiders of the Lost Ark onto the world.
It's an absolute juggernaut.
It is redefining the blockbuster. And amidst all this global phenomenal success, Spielberg is reading international press, and he comes across a French review of Raiders.
And this critic makes a very specific comparison.
Yes, they say Raiders feels like a cinematic translation of a comic book series called Tintin.
Now, Spielberg, being an American filmmaker who grew up on a completely different set of pop culture touchstones, he had never actually encountered Tintin.
Never heard of it.
Right. The character simply didn't have the same footprint in the United States as he did in Europe. So Spielberg gets his hands on some of the books. And keep in mind, these editions he gets are entirely in French.
So he cannot read a single word of the dialogue or the exposition?
He can't read a word of it.
But he doesn't need to, right? Because the visual storytelling is so strong, he is immediately captivated just by the art and the paneling.
Precisely. What's fascinating here is the serendipity of that creative collision. You have Spielberg, who has just codified the modern American adventure hero with Indiana Jones, a character built on serialized, globe-trotting cliffhangers.
Yeah.
And he's suddenly staring at a European property that had been perfecting that exact same narrative rhythm for decades. He saw the kinetic energy, the way Hergé paced an action sequence across a page. It spoke his exact cinematic language.
Meanwhile, on the other side of the Atlantic, you have Hergé himself,
Yeah.
the Belgian creator of Tintin. And his relationship with adaptations of his life's work is, well, it's pretty bleak up to this point.
Bleak is definitely the right word. Hergé had already seen his comics adapted. There were live-action films in the 1960s like Tintin and the Golden Fleece and Tintin and the Blue Oranges.
Got some animated ones, too.
Yeah, like Tintin and the Lake of Sharks.
Yeah.
And he actively loathed them. He felt they completely missed the target. The live-action films just looked like actors wandering around in uncomfortable cosplay, and the animation lacked the dynamic stark of his original drawings.
But according to the historical overview, Hergé had an entirely different opinion of Steven Spielberg. He reportedly believed that Spielberg was the only living director capable of doing his creation justice on the big screen.
You really have to think about what a massive statement that is.
It's a huge endorsement.
It is. Why would Hergé trust an American blockbuster director over a European filmmaker who had actually grown up immersed in the cultural nuances of the source material?
Right.
It comes down to what Hergé valued most in his own work, which was the pacing. Hergé recognized that Raiders of the Lost Ark possessed the exact same breathless momentum that he engineered into his comic panels.
He saw that Spielberg knew how to construct a thrill ride that never felt exhausting.
Exactly.
Yeah.
He saw a kindred spirit.
So this mutual admiration society naturally leads to them trying to connect. They finally arranged to meet in person in 1983. Spielberg is in London. He's deep into filming the Raiders prequel, Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom. The meeting is set.
But it never happens.
It never happens. It is one of the great tragedies of cinema history. Hergé passed away that exact week.
That meeting is a massive what if for film nerds. If they had sat down in a room together in 1983, what kind of film would they have conceptualized?
It's impossible not to wonder. But Spielberg's obvious public reverence for the material clearly resonated, because Hergé's widow, Fanny, stepped in and decided to honor what her husband had wanted. She granted Spielberg the film rights, and they finalized a 3-year option in 1984.
But as anyone who follows the film industry knows, possessing the rights to a property and actually getting a movie greenlit and shot are two completely different realities.
Which kicks off decades of false starts. So Spielberg has the rights. His immediate instinct is to commission a script from Melissa Matheson.
She had just penned E.T. the Extraterrestrial for him.
Right. So on paper, putting the writer of E.T. together with the director of Raiders to make Tintin seems like an absolute slam dunk.
It makes total sense.
But the script she turns in is bizarre. It's a story about Tintin battling ivory hunters in Africa. And Spielberg's casting vision at the time. He wanted Jack Nicholson to play Captain Haddock.
I actually think that detail tells you everything you need to know about why it didn't work.
How so?
Look at what Spielberg was trying to do. He envisioned Tintin as an Indiana Jones for kids. The plot about ivory hunters in Africa is an incredibly standard, trope-heavy 1980s American adventure premise. It completely ignores the specific political and investigative journalism angles that often drove the European comics.
That makes sense. And Jack Nicholson is Haddock.
Right. Casting Jack Nicholson, who at that point was one of the biggest, most cynical, larger-than-life movie stars on the planet, just shows that Spielberg was trying to wedge this delicate European comic into a massive, star-driven, live-action Hollywood blockbuster mold. It was a tonal mismatch from the jump.
So Spielberg ultimately realized it wasn't gelling. He shelves it and moves on to direct Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade. The option expires, and the rights revert back to the Hergé Foundation.
And for years, the rights just bounce around Europe. You have legendary directors circling it. Roman Polanski expresses interest. Claude Berry wants to produce it. Warner Bros. Tries to negotiate for it.
But the Hergé Foundation holds the line.
They did. They were incredibly loyal to Spielberg's creative vision, even if that vision was currently dormant. They essentially waited for him.
They played the long game, and it paid off because in 2001, Spielberg publicly hints that he is looking at the property again. This time, he mentions he's considering computer animation.
But then by November 2002, his studio, DreamWorks, officially re-options the rights. And the internal debate is clearly still raging, because shortly after, he pivots back and says he just wants to produce a live-action version.
Which brings us to 2004. Spielberg is formulating a plan for a live-action trilogy. And he picks up the phone and calls Peter Jackson.
This is the turning point.
It really is. Now, he isn't calling Jackson to ask him to co-direct or produce. He's calling him with a very specific technical question. He wants to know if Jackson's visual effects house down in New Zealand, Weta Digital, could create a photorealistic computer-generated version of Tintin's dog, Snowy.
He just wanted a CGI dog running around interacting with live actors.
It is wild to think that this entire cinematic endeavor hinged on a casual phone call about a digital terrier.
But you have to remember who Spielberg is calling. Peter Jackson wasn't just a VFX pioneer. He was a lifelong, obsessive fanatic of the Tintin comics, and he was fresh off revolutionizing the industry with motion capture technology.
Oh, right. He had just brought Gollum to life in The Lord of the Rings.
Exactly. And he had seamlessly integrated a massive digital ape into a live-action New York in King Kong.
So Spielberg asks about a digital dog, and Jackson essentially hits the brakes. He tells Spielberg that live action is fundamentally the wrong medium for this story.
Jackson's argument was completely sound. He told Spielberg that if you take a human actor, put him in Tintin's iconic +4s, give him that famous swooping cowlick, and have him act opposite someone in a captain's outfit, they aren't going to look like the characters.
They're going to look like actors in silly costumes.
Exactly. You completely lose the stylized magic of the artwork.
So Jackson pitches a massive pivot. He says, forget live action. Let's use motion capture for everything. Let's create a wholly digital world where the characters look like, in his words, real Hergé people.
It's an intoxicating pitch. They wanted to maintain the exact proportions and caricatured designs of the comics.
The bulbous noses, the distinct jawline.
Right, but render them with total photorealism. They wanted you to see the microscopic fibers of their wool sweaters, the pores on their skin, how light refracted through their irises, all while remaining undeniably stylized.
It sounds great in theory, but pitching that to a studio requires proof. So in November 2006, they organize a test shoot. They go to a soundstage in Playa Vista, Los Angeles. And this isn't just any soundstage. This is the exact volume where James Cameron is currently conducting his own motion capture experiments for Avatar.
That room must have been incredible.
Andy Serkis, the pioneer of the medium, is there as a test subject. Peter Jackson himself literally steps into the volume to stand in for Tintin.
Can you imagine the sheer concentration of cinematic innovation in that room?
Mm-hmm.
You have Steven Spielberg and Peter Jackson directing a test, Andy Serkis performing, and James Cameron and Robert Zemeckis just standing on the sidelines watching it happen. It was a convergence of the greatest minds in visual effects.
Weta Digital takes the data from that test shoot back to New Zealand, and they produce a 20-minute, fully rendered test reel. And that reel completely converts Spielberg.
It was sold.
He officially abandons his live-action roots for this project and leaps into the digital realm. And for a director who had spent decades physically framing shots through a traditional camera lens, his approach to this new medium is incredibly revealing.
This is one of my favorite details.
He famously noted that for his entire career, he kept one eye closed while looking through a viewfinder because he needed to see the world in 2 dimensions, just like the audience would on a theater screen. But for Tintin, because he was directing in a virtual space using a 3D camera monitor, he said he finally kept both eyes open.
That phrase, both eyes open, is a brilliant summation of his creative unmooring here. Think about what it takes for a master of a craft to completely discard the tools they've used for 40 years.
It has to be terrifying.
If you've ever had to learn a highly complex, completely alien software system later in your career, you understand that terrifying vulnerability. Spielberg was suddenly on a bare soundstage covered in gray mats. But he realized he was unchained from physics.
Right, he could grab a virtual camera monitor and physically walk it around the actors in real time.
And instantly see them rendered as their characters in a fully realized digital environment. He didn't have to wait for a lighting crew to reset massive physical rigs. He could just ask the tech team to move the digital sun.
Let's talk about that lighting, actually, because the technological leaps required to make this film look the way it does are staggering. Our Wikipedia source dives into how Weta Digital quickly realized that standard computer animation techniques weren't going to cut it.
The software simply didn't exist to render the kind of nuanced atmospheric lighting they wanted.
So Weta partnered with NVIDIA, and they literally had to invent a brand new proprietary ray tracing software architecture from scratch. They called it Pantaray.
I'm glad you brought up Pantaray, because the technical achievement there cannot be overstated. We need to distinguish this from how animated films were typically lit back then.
Right. The traditional method was shadow mapping.
Exactly. Without getting too bogged down in the math, traditional shadow mapping is essentially a shortcut. The computer looks at a light source and paints a dark patch where a shadow should fall.
It's efficient, but it looks slightly artificial.
Right. Ray tracing, however, doesn't fake anything. The software physically simulates millions of individual photons of light. It calculates how a beam of light comes through a window, hits a wooden table, absorbs some of the brown color of the wood, and then bounces off to softly illuminate the underside of a character's chin.
So it's the difference between drawing a shadow on the floor and simulating the actual physics of the sun.
Precisely. And Pantaray was built specifically to handle indirect lighting, the way light bounces around inside a room. Doing that math requires hundreds, sometimes thousands of times more computational power than shadow mapping. It was a gargantuan undertaking.
But here's the ultimate punchline to all of this unbelievable technological innovation. You have supercomputers simulating the physics of light, you have Oscar-winning directors wearing motion capture suits, and do you know what the animators explicitly stated was the single most difficult, hair-pulling aspect of the entire production?
I have to assume it was the fluid dynamics of the ocean during the massive storm sequences, or maybe the structural collapse of the cranes at the end?
Nope. It was the dog. It was Snowy, the exact reason Spielberg called Jackson in 2004.
That is hilarious. Why was Snowy the bottleneck?
Because Snowy wasn't motion captured. You obviously cannot put a skin-tight lycra suit covered in reflective ping-pong balls on a wire fox terrier and expect it to hit its marks and act alongside Jamie Bell.
Of course not.
So while all the human characters were driven by human performances, Snowy had to be keyframe animated by hand, the old-fashioned way, entirely within the computer. And the animators struggled endlessly.
It's the fur, isn't it?
Yes. Wire fox terriers have a very specific wiry type of white fur. Rendering that fur, lighting it against a white background, and making the hand-animated dog feel like it belonged in the exact same physical space as the motion-captured actors was a nightmare. They eventually had to bring a real dog into the mocap studio and track its movements just to build a reference library for how a dog actually shifts its weight.
The irony is just perfect. They invent an entirely new rendering software, but the cartoon dog is what brings the server farm to its knees.
So they had the tech sorted, now they need the cast. And the roster they assemble is absurdly stacked. But even getting the actors into the volume was a massive ordeal.
The casting was heavily impacted by the business side of the studio system. Initially, they had cast Thomas Brodie Sangster as Tintin. Most people know him now from The Queen's Gambit or Game of Thrones, but back then he was a rising star off of Love Actually. He was locked in.
But then Universal Pictures, who had agreed to co-finance the picture with Paramount, suddenly got incredibly nervous. It's 2008. The studio executives are looking at the box office returns for recent motion capture films, specifically Robert Zemeckis' Beowulf and Monster House.
And those films underperformed.
Greatly underperformed. Combine that with the fact that Spielberg and Jackson were reportedly demanding a massive 30% cut of the gross profits right off the top, and Universal just bailed. They pulled out right before production was supposed to start.
That kind of late-stage withdrawal usually kills a movie outright. Sony's Columbia Pictures eventually stepped in to fill the financing gap, but the ensuing delay wreaked havoc on the schedule. By the time they were ready to shoot, Brodie Sangster was no longer available.
And Peter Jackson immediately knows who to call. He suggests Jamie Bell.
Right.
Jackson had just put Bell through the absolute ringer on his remake of King Kong, so he knew Bell had the physical stamina required for a visual effects-heavy, physically demanding motion capture performance. Bell steps in as the intrepid boy reporter.
But the real anchor of the cast, and perhaps the smartest casting choice they made, was Andy Serkis as Captain Haddock.
Yes.
Spielberg explicitly suggested Serkis, calling him a great and funny actor, based entirely on his physical performances as Gollum in Kong.
Our sources highlight a fantastic anecdote about that. When Serkis got the initial call from Peter Jackson's office about working on a Tintin movie, he was actually terrified. Given his resume of playing bizarre creatures, he genuinely thought Jackson was going to ask him to crawl around on his hands and knees and play Snowy the dog.
I mean, you can't blame him for assuming that.
Not at all.
But Serkis obviously took the role of Haddock, and he approached it with intense seriousness. He went back and reread the comics, and he noticed something that a lot of casual readers miss. There is a deeply surreal, almost Monty Python-esque absurdity to Haddock's dialogue and situations.
Yeah.
Serkis researched historical maritime behaviors, and he made a highly specific, defining choice. He gave Haddock a Scottish accent.
Why Scottish? The character is ostensibly Belgian, or at least generic European, in the books.
Serkis felt the Scottish brogue gave Haddock what he described as a rawness, an emotional availability, a more Celtic kind of feel. He wasn't just doing a cartoonish pirate voice. He was building the psychological profile of a deeply flawed, fiercely loyal, and hilariously abrasive man.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. The villain. They cast Daniel Craig as Ivan Ivanovich Sakharine. And what's wild here is that Sakharine is a relatively minor character in the original comics.
They drastically elevated his role to make him the primary antagonist.
Spielberg called Craig's performance a champagne villain. He was elegant, sophisticated, but completely ruthless. Craig himself joked that he didn't have to look far for inspiration. He was just leaning into the grand English tradition of playing bad guys.
And we can't ignore the comic relief. You have Simon Pegg and Nick Frost, the legendary duo behind Shaun of the Dead, stepping in to play Thompson and Thompson, the identical but completely unrelated, hopelessly incompetent police detectives.
The story goes that Spielberg just invited Pegg to the set one day and offered him the role on the spot.
The cast is brilliant, but we really need to examine the writers, because the screenplay is credited to a trio of British comedy and sci-fi absolute heavyweights: Stephen Moffat, Edgar Wright, and Joe Cornish.
The development of this script is a saga unto itself. Stephen Moffat, who had created the hit sitcom Coupling and would later run Sherlock, was the first one in. He said he was essentially love-bombed by Steven Spielberg.
Spielberg promised Moffat that if he agreed to write the script, Spielberg would act as a human shield and protect him from any studio notes or executive interference.
That is an offer no writer can refuse. So Moffat signs on. He finishes his first draft. But then, the 2007-2008 Writers Guild of America strike shuts down the entire industry, pencils down.
Yeah.
By the time the strike is resolved, Moffat's career has exploded. He's been offered the holy grail of British television, taking over as the executive producer and head writer of Doctor Who.
So Spielberg and Jackson gracefully let Moffat out of his contract. They need a new writer to take the baton. They hire Edgar Wright, who is hot off directing Hot Fuzz.
And Wright brings in his frequent collaborator and fellow hardcore Tintin aficionado, Joe Cornish.
They sit down and write 2 drafts together. But then Wright's schedule implodes because he has to leave to direct Scott Pilgrim vs. the World.
So it ultimately falls to Joe Cornish to stay in the room and finish the final polish of the script under the direct daily supervision of Spielberg and Jackson.
You really have to look at the alchemy of that writing room. You have a revolving door of profoundly British, highly witty writers. How did their sensibilities blend with Spielberg's?
It's quite a mix.
You have Moffat's signature intricate puzzle box plotting. You have Wright's hyperkinetic, visually driven comedic transitions. And you have Cornish's grounded, slightly cynical sense of adventure banter.
I think that British injection is the only reason the movie works. It provided the exact pacing and dry wit needed to counterweight Spielberg's tendency toward very earnest, very American blockbuster sentimentality.
But those writers were also handed a monumental structural nightmare. How do you take the episodic, serialized nature of a weekly comic strip, where a plot can meander for weeks, and compress it into a tight, 3-act, 2-hour Hollywood feature film?
And that brings us to the plot mashup. They didn't just adapt one book. The script is a Frankenstein's monster constructed from 3 distinct storylines: The Crab with the Golden Claws, The Secret of the Unicorn, and Red Rackham's Treasure.
It's an incredibly dense narrative weave. If we break it down, The Crab with the Golden Claws is utilized primarily for character introduction. That's the book where Tintin first meets Captain Haddock on the cargo ship, the Cariboujan. The Secret of the Unicorn provides the narrative engine, the mystery of the 3 model ships, and the hidden scrolls that act as a treasure map. And Red Rackham's Treasure supplies the historical pirate lore and the ultimate destination.
So we end up with a movie that is just bursting at the seams. We start with Tintin buying a model ship in a sun-drenched outdoor market in Brussels. Within minutes, he's being shot at. He gets kidnapped by Sakharine's thugs.
He escapes his cell on the Cariboujan, meets Haddock, who has been kept in a perpetual stupor by his mutinous crew, and they escape the ship on a lifeboat during a massive storm.
Then they hijack a seaplane, fly it into a thunderstorm, crash land in the Moroccan desert, suffer severe dehydration hallucinations where Haddock flashes back to his 17th century ancestor, Sir Francis Haddock, fighting pirates.
And the whole thing culminates in a literal heavy machinery duel using giant shipping cranes on the docks.
It is relentless, and this right here is exactly where the audience reception sharply divides. Let's look at the praise first, because the sheer momentum of that mashed-up plot structure worked like gangbusters for a specific demographic.
Absolutely. Let's pull from Jeremy John's review. He was ecstatic about the pacing. He loved that the movie didn't waste time on a drawn-out origin story.
He specifically praised the narrative choice to have the villain, Sakharine, know way more about the treasure than Tintin does at the beginning. It instantly makes Tintin the underdog who is playing catch-up, which automatically gets the audience invested.
Jans also raved about the character dynamics, noting that Haddock evolves from a drunken comic relief sidekick into a genuine co-lead by the third act. He was particularly effusive about the action set pieces, wasn't he?
Oh, he called them absurdly awesome. He praised the virtual cinematography as being just nuts and argued that the 3D execution was some of the best he had ever experienced, which he directly attributed to Peter Jackson's rigorous quality control as a producer.
That's high praise.
But the line from John's review that really cemented his perspective for me was when he said, "This movie is like Uncharted: The Young Nathan Drake Chronicles."
For anyone unfamiliar, Uncharted is a massive, incredibly cinematic video game franchise about a wisecracking treasure hunter. So Johns is using that as high praise. He's saying the film delivers a perfect, modern, breathless, puzzle-solving adventure ride.
I push back on that a bit, though, because if we connect this to the bigger picture, that exact comparison, calling it a video game, is the precise reason the diehard Hergé purists despised the movie. What Jeremy Jahns saw as breathless action, the hardcore fan saw as an exhausting, inauthentic betrayal of the source material.
You're exactly right. Let's look at the backlash from those IMDb reviews. We have to understand that these reviewers aren't casual moviegoers. As one of them explicitly stated, they have been reading these books for over 30 years. The rhythm of Hergé's storytelling is baked into their DNA.
These purists completely tear the three-book mashup apart. One fan described the resulting narrative as being fundamentally less than the sum of its parts. They acknowledged that the writers managed to cram all the familiar motifs and characters in there, but the execution felt horribly jarring.
There was one reviewer who used a very specific musical analogy to describe how the script felt. Do you have that quote?
Yes, and it perfectly encapsulates the frustration. The reviewer wrote, "It was as if it was a song made by mixing a Led Zeppelin song, a Pink Floyd song, and a song by Sarah McLachlan. Despite all the beauty of the individual songs, the result will be a mess."
That is a brilliant critique. It perfectly illustrates the eternal tension of Hollywood adaptations. Do you streamline and compress the narrative to ensure relentless pacing and constant stimulation? Or do you respect the episodic subtlety, the slower investigative moments, and the methodical rhythm of the original European text?
It's a tough balance.
Another IMDb reviewer echoed Johns' point, but as a weapon. They wrote, "Absent from the movie is all the subtlety in the book. What is present here is a very heavy-handed, video game-like approach."
So for the purists, Spielberg turned a beloved piece of mid-century literature into a noisy PlayStation cutscene. But it wasn't just the breakneck pacing of the plot that divided audiences. The visual aesthetic was just as intensely debated.
The motion capture technology we spent so much time dissecting, it was a massive gamble. And for many, it did not pay off.
Mainstream critics were generally on board. Roger Ebert, who was notoriously picky about 3D and digital gimmicks, actually praised it. He said the technology felt like a genuine enhancement to traditional 2D animation, rather than just a distraction.
Richard Corliss over at Time magazine called the visuals Tintinastic.
But there was a very vocal, highly articulate contingent of cultural critics and fans who felt a deep, visceral sense of unease while watching it.
We are talking about the Uncanny Valley. This is that well-documented psychological phenomenon where a computer-generated figure looks almost perfectly human, but just slightly imperceptibly off. And instead of feeling empathy for the character, the viewer's brain triggers a feeling of revulsion or creepiness.
Steve Rose, writing for The Guardian, explicitly compared the unsettling vibe of Tintin to the famously dead-eyed animation in Robert Zemeckis' The Polar Express. He said the characters in Tintin were too human and not human at all.
Manohla Dargis, the co-chief film critic for The New York Times, wrote perhaps the most evocative description of this effect. She observed that the main character resembled Hergé's creation. It was eerily different, as if, like Pinocchio, his transformation into human form had been prematurely interrupted.
That is a devastatingly precise sentence, and interrupted Pinocchio. It really highlights the fundamental aesthetic clash at the heart of the movie's design, because the art style of the original comics is not just famous, it is legendary.
It has a name. Hergé pioneered what is known in the art world as the line clear, or the clear line style.
Exactly. The clear line style is highly specific. It features continuous lines of absolutely uniform thickness. There is no cross-hatching. There are bright, flat colors with virtually no shading or contrast.
But the most crucial element of the clear line style is the character design. It is incredibly simple. Look at Tintin's face in the comic. It is a circle. He has two tiny ink dots for eyes, a curved stroke for a nose, and a small line for a mouth.
Why does that matter? Why is simple better?
The comic book theorist Scott McCloud has written extensively about this. He argues that this severe simplicity is the secret to Tintin's global resonance. Because the face is so basic, it acts as a blank slate. The reader's brain effortlessly projects their own emotions and identity onto that face. Tintin isn't a specific person. He becomes a universal avatar for the reader.
But in the film, Peter Jackson and Spielberg's longtime cinematographer, Janusz Kaminski, threw the clear-line philosophy completely out the window. Jackson explicitly stated in interviews that he wanted a film noirish, very atmospheric look.
So Kaminski lit the virtual sets like a gritty 1940s thriller. They added dynamic, high-contrast lighting. They put deep, terrifying shadows in the corners of rooms. They rendered dirt on the trench coat, sweat, and stubble on Haddock's chin.
One furious IMDb reviewer complained bitterly that the movie was too dark and murky, arguing that it entirely missed the optimistic brightness of Hergé's world.
Furthermore, Jeremy Jahns, even in his overwhelmingly positive review, stumbled onto a really fascinating point about how this hyper-realism actually sabotages the comedy. He noted that there are moments where the film tries to execute physical slapstick, the kind of broad, gravity-defying gags that happen in the comics.
But Johns pointed out that when an unrealistic, cartoonish gag happens in a photorealistic world, it breaks the viewer's suspension of disbelief. Johns said, when unrealistic slapstick-type stuff that wouldn't actually work starts to happen, it starts making you see it more like a cartoon and less like a movie, and it starts to become a bummer.
It's such a profound observation. When you hyper-realize a world, you change the physical rules of that world. Think about it. When you read a book, your imagination fills in the gaps perfectly. You design the characters in your mind.
But when a movie explicitly renders every single pore, every single eyelash, and the exact specular highlight reflecting off a character's eyeball, as Jackson boasted Weta Digital did, does it actually rob you of your own imagination? Does giving a character realistic human eyes paradoxically make them less relatable than the simple ink dots Hergé drew?
This raises an important question, and it transitions us into what is undeniably the most severe academic criticism the film faced. The purists weren't just upset about the uncanny valley or the rushed pacing. They felt there was a fundamental thematic assassination of Hergé's legacy.
We really need to talk about Tom McCarthy here. McCarthy is an acclaimed novelist, but he also literally wrote a critical study on the Tintin books. So when the movie came out, his reaction wasn't just disappointment. It was absolute vitriolic outrage. He called the Hollywood treatment of these characters truly execrable.
McCarthy's argument is rooted in a deep literary analysis of the original texts. He argued that the core themes of the original books, especially the secret of the unicorn, were heavily preoccupied with concepts of fakeness, phoniness, and counterfeit. It was about uncovering hidden truths in a deceptive world.
He believed that the Hollywood adaptation completely stripped away these underlying philosophical ideas and replaced them with shallow blockbuster tropes.
And what did the movie replace those themes with, according to McCarthy? He said the film was nothing more than a seminar on monetization through self-empowerment.
That is a brutal, scathing indictment of the American blockbuster formula. He's arguing that the film's climax essentially boils down to believe in yourself so you can beat up the bad guy and get the gold.
McCarthy felt the film fundamentally misunderstood the soul of Tintin. The metaphors he used to illustrate his anger are incredible. He said adapting Tintin into this kind of relentless action movie was like making a biopic of Nietzsche that depicts him as a born-again Christian, or of Gandhi as a trigger-happy Rambo blasting his way through the Raj.
A trigger-happy Rambo Gandhi. You simply cannot get a harsher review from a literary critic than that. And honestly, you can see exactly where McCarthy and the IMDb purists are coming from when you look at the specific narrative choices the filmmakers were forced to make.
Take the villain, for example. In the original book of The Secret of the Unicorn, the antagonists are the Bird brothers. They are two relatively grounded, slimy, conniving antique dealers.
But Spielberg and Jackson looked at two antique dealers and decided they weren't cinematic enough. They weren't an existential threat. So they promoted Sakharine to the role of the main villain. And not only did they promote him, they fundamentally rewrote his entire bloodline to fit a Hollywood template.
They made him the direct, vengeful descendant of the pirate Red Rackham, creating this epic, multi-generational blood feud between his family and Captain Haddock's family.
Why do that? Why abandon the antique dealers? because a $135 million American studio tentpole structurally demands a boss fight at the end of the third act. They needed a physical confrontation. You can't end a massive summer blockbuster with the heroes outsmarting a couple of shady pawn shop owners.
That's why the film ends with Haddock and Saccharin literally dueling each other with construction equipment, driving massive shipping cranes at each other on the docks of Brussels.
It is an undeniably incredible action sequence. It's visually stunning and thrilling to watch. But McCarthy's point is that it is light years away from the tone of a European comic book drawn in the 1940s.
So it brings up a genuine, perhaps unsolvable debate. Is it even mathematically possible to translate the specific sensibilities, the quiet moments, and the political undertones of a mid-century European comic to a modern, mega-budget American studio blockbuster without losing the original soul?
Or does the financial reality of the blockbuster medium inevitably demand that the source material be fed into a wood chipper and reshaped into familiar, easily digestible Hollywood tropes?
It is the eternal struggle of adaptation. There is no right answer. If you stay too fiercely faithful to the quiet pacing of the book, you risk boring the massive global audience who just paid $15 for a thrilling 3D roller coaster ride, the audience that Jeremy Jans represents.
But if you change too much, you betray the very foundation of what made the property beloved in the first place, completely alienating the core fans who kept the property alive for decades.
So after all that debate, after all the technological innovation that pushed computer graphics forward by a decade, after assembling the greatest British comedy writers, surviving a writer's strike and waiting 30 years, how did the movie actually perform?
Let's look at the hard numbers, the accolades, and the strange phantom sequel that has haunted Hollywood ever since.
Financially, the film was a massive success, but the geography of that success tells the entire story of the character's cultural footprint. The film grossed nearly $374 million globally against its $135 million budget, but it only made about $77 million in North America.
The American audiences just didn't turn out.
The real money, nearly $296 million, came from overseas.
Which perfectly aligns with everything we've talked about. The character is European. It was massive in France and its native Belgium. It broke records in India, becoming the highest-grossing animated film of all time there upon its release. It dominated the international box office.
And critically, within the industry, it broke major ground during awards season. It won the Golden Globe Award for Best Animated Feature Film. This is a huge historical milestone. It was the first all-digital, motion-captured animated film to ever win that award. It legitimized the medium.
It was also the first non-Pixar film to ever win the category. On top of that, the legendary John Williams, who composed a wildly inventive score blending 1920s jazz with sweeping pirate orchestrations, was nominated for an Academy Award.
So let's look at the board. You have a movie that grosses almost $400 million globally. It wins a Golden Globe, it previews a new technology works, and you have Steven Spielberg and Peter Jackson attached.
In any normal Hollywood scenario, a sequel would have been greenlit on Monday morning and in theaters within 3 years. But here we are, sitting in 2026, and the sequel has been trapped in the deepest depths of development hell for an unbelievable 15 years.
The timeline of this sequel is almost tragicomic. It is a masterclass in Hollywood broken promises. Originally, the plan was simple and publicly announced. Spielberg directs the first one. Then, Peter Jackson steps into the director's chair for the second one as soon as he finishes shooting his Hobbit trilogy.
They even announced the specific books it would adapt, a two-parter based on the 7 crystal balls and Prisoners of the Sun.
But then the writer shuffle starts all over again. Screenwriter Anthony Horowitz was brought in to write the sequel, and he publicly stated, actually, those 2 books are too complex. They will be the third movie. I'm writing a completely different unannounced story for the second one.
The shifting goalpost just never stopped. In 2011, producer Kathleen Kennedy confidently stated that the script might be done by early 2012, they'd shoot the motion capture in the summer, and the film would hit theaters by Christmas 2014, or maybe mid-2015 at the latest.
But 2014 came and went with total silence. In 2015, Jamie Bell did an interview where he claimed the movie was officially titled Tintin and the Temple of the Sun, and he hoped they would shoot in 2016.
But then, later that exact same year, Anthony Horowitz gave an interview admitting he wasn't even working on the script anymore and had no idea if the movie was even happening. By 2016, his scripts were officially scrapped.
Then the rumors started mutating. Trade papers suggested maybe Jackson would only produce the sequel, not direct it. Then Spielberg suggested they were secretly developing a third movie at the exact same time to shoot them back to back. Spielberg kept acting as the cheerleader, assuring fans as late as 2018 that Jackson was definitely going to write a script soon.
And it just keeps going. As recently as April 2022, Jamie Bell gave an interview to Forbes. And you can tell he's just amused by the absurdity of it at this point. He joked about the endless delay, saying, if they said, let's get the band back together, we'd go do it. It's going to be weird if I played Tintin at 45, but still the technology allows it, so that's fine.
And then, unbelievably, in June 2024, Andy Serkis casually dropped in an interview that Peter Jackson is definitely still working on it.
At this point, it has become a cinematic white whale. Is Peter Jackson actually sitting at a computer in New Zealand writing a script? Will we ever see a 45-year-old Jamie Bell put the ping-pong ball suit back on? It feels like the sequel has transcended being a genuine Hollywood project and has just become an urban myth that actors get asked about on red carpets.
So what does this all mean? We started with a handshake in London that never happened in 1983, and we end with a sequel that hasn't materialized in 15 years. It is time to wrap up our journey.
We have certainly covered an immense amount of ground today. We've explored a film born from a profound mutual admiration between two masters of entirely different mediums.
We've seen a production that demanded revolutionary, boundary-pushing visual effects technology, requiring the literal invention of new physics-based software.
We dissected a script shaped by a revolving door of brilliant British comedy minds, interrupted by massive industry strikes.
And we analyzed a final product that was received with a fascinating, volatile mix of box office adoration, critical awards, and absolute, vehement purist outrage.
It truly is the ultimate case study in the power and the peril of adaptation. And as we leave you today, we want to offer a final provocative thought for you to mull over. We spent a lot of time today talking about the motion capture technology that Weta Digital developed for this film. Peter Jackson and Steven Spielberg used that technology to perfectly replicate the physical movements of human actors, trying to capture the microscopic pores on their skin and the individual fibers of their clothes. They were aiming for ultimate reality.
But maybe, just maybe, the true magic of a comic strip isn't found in capturing reality perfectly. Maybe the magic of Hergé's work, the reason it has endured for nearly a century, is actually found in the blank spaces.
The spaces between those simple, uniform ink lines.
Exactly. The clear line style is an abstraction that requires the reader's imagination to do half the work, to project their own soul into the character. Those are the spaces that Hollywood technology, with all of its millions of dollars, its massive server farms, and its unbelievable processing power, can never truly render on a screen.
It's a profound thought to leave on. We want to thank you so much for giving us your time and joining us on this incredibly deep dive into the adventures of Tintin. We hope we've given you some new frameworks and perspectives to chew on the next time you sit down to watch a massive blockbuster adaptation of a book you love. Keep questioning the media you consume, keep analyzing the hidden machinery of the things you enjoy, and most importantly, stay curious. We will see you next time.